am a certified sex therapist, and I'm also a licensed professional counselor. And I own a private practice in Texas in the DFW area. And I specialize in couples. And so I see a lot of couples for it could be sex therapy, regarding sex and their relationship, or it could also be general relationship problems that they're having. So my specialty is definitely couples. And I also have specialty in neurodiverse couples where I have a lot of clients who are autistic or have ADHD and help them navigate their relationship through that lens.
Interesting. Yeah, that is really interesting. What role do you feel like conditions such as ADHD and ADD play in sexuality or relationships?
Yeah, I think there's two major categories. One would be communication. I think neurodivergent people just communicate differently. So if their partner is neurotypical, sometimes there can be a lot of misinterpretations, and especially around the topic of sex, right? They could be trying to say one thing and their partner's not understanding it or taking it a different way than how they meant it. And so I try to do a lot of helping them kind of like interpret each other. And then the second big category is just sensory sensitivities or sensory overload, especially when we're talking about touch or sound or smells. Those can make physical intimacy difficult for some people.
Absolutely. What drew you to this profession?
I was already a counselor when I started the process of becoming a sex therapist. And I personally went through a sexual assault like almost 7 years ago and got my own, like as I was becoming a counselor, I was getting my own help and my own trauma work. And my therapist at that time had recommended a sex therapist. And I didn't even know that was a job, to be honest, at the time. And I was like, well, I didn't know there was a specialty like that. And so just from my own personal experience looking into what sex therapy looks like is what piqued my interest and led me to where I am now.
Is there anything in particular that you see tends to be a recurrent theme in your clients that's blocking them from having a sexually fulfilling life?
Oh, yeah, there can be lots of reasons for that. The biggest issue I work with regarding couples is desire discrepancy, where one partner has a higher libido than the other. Um, and not that that is inherently a problem. I think some couples can probably be just fine with that, like an acceptance that we don't have the same libido and we don't need to. We're going to make time for our intimate life, in some way. But where it becomes a problem is when it is causing stress, where the partner with low libido feels pressure to have sex and the partner with a higher libido feels like their partner doesn't care about what they want, right? And then they start to turn away from each other or view each other negatively as if we're against each other when really we just have different preferences and different needs and different wants, that can become hard to navigate. And so I find that like within that scope, I find that conflict avoidance tends to be very problematic, because if we have these differences, it feels like a conflict. And so I don't really want to talk about that. I want to avoid it. But then when you avoid, it builds resentment, it kind of comes to a head. And so underneath all that, it can just be anxiety, it could be shame, right? Shame or guilt for what they want or what they don't want. All those things get in the way of talking about it. And then when it is talked about, it's not them coming to the table to say, hey, let's have this hard conversation. It's usually, well, now I'm pissed off at you and we need to talk about it. And that's never a great place to come from. So it's layered. It's definitely complex and layered.
One of the things that I really heard you mention a lot is communication. So it sounds like that is playing one of the biggest roles in all of this. It's interesting because us coming from Live Jasmine, one of the things that is not unique to these particular relationships, but one of the things that I think, because of the nature of the site, in order for a member to really get the experience they're looking for, they have to communicate so clearly and so explicitly about what their needs and desires are. And the model communicates very clearly about what she's comfortable with and what she does and what she doesn't do. And I found that when the two find common ground, these relationships last for years. I mean, I have interviewed members that have seen the same model for 15, 20 years. And I think it's this component of communication that is really bonding them, of maybe the member feeling accepted and heard for their vulnerable requests and shares. And I just feel like when you find someone or a place where you feel safe to do that, you really almost stick with it because it's so rare in our day-to-day lives. But I'm curious your thoughts on that.
It makes a ton of sense to me. And that's what I wish all couples were doing, right? If, like, in an imaginary world, best case scenario is we come to the table, we lay it all out there, we respect each other's differences. If I have a hard line in the sand, please don't push that, because I want to respect you and I want you to respect me. Let's negotiate. Let's see where our common ground is. What are we both comfortable with? What does that mean our sex life is going to look like? That's the stuff that sets you up for success, right? But I think, like, to your point, on the site, both are communicating so clearly, and that can set you up for very long-term relationships. I think where, like, couples, long-term relationships, people who are married, let's say, I think where they get really tripped up is we don't have those hard conversations from the jump, right? In the beginning of our relationship, it's like the honeymoon phase, the rose-colored glasses. All we're focused on is, like, everything we have in common and how in love we are. And I don't want to mess that up because it feels so good. And then when our differences start coming to light, a lot of people don't want to address those because, in a way, they're really scared of rejection. Like, their partners who they love the most, it's going to hurt them the most if that person rejects them or makes them feel bad or shames them or dismisses them. So people can have that fear and they decide, I'm not even going to risk getting rejected. I just won't say anything. And then years go on where you're not saying anything and they're not saying anything. And then I promise you, it'll always come to a head. And so ultimately what I'm saying is the only way to get through that is you have to take that emotional risk. Otherwise, you're not going to get what you want.
So you have to be emotionally vulnerable.
Absolutely, 100%.
And you're on the ground floor working with people, with their sexualities, with their relationships. From what you hear, why do you think it is so difficult for us to be emotionally vulnerable especially with someone that we live with or our lifelong partner?
Yeah, it is usually some childhood wounds or maybe even early adult wounds. I work a lot from an attachment lens. And so with clients, I will explore, what was your childhood like? What were your parents like? What was their relationship like? What was your relationship with them like? How were your siblings? And often what I find is that the people who have a really hard time being vulnerable did not have emotional safety in their household. They learned somewhere along the way, it's easier to not avoid because I'm a burden. No one is really going to pay attention to me. So I'm just going to survive and get through it. And then, when you're a child, that adaptive skill of survival makes sense, but it starts not making sense in your adult relationships. Like that adaptive skill is now maladaptive.
Mm-hmm.
People find that out, like, oh, yeah, that's why I'm so scared to say anything.
That makes a lot of sense. Like growing up as a child, it maybe kept you safe in that environment. But as an adult, and you're now out of that environment, most likely, it's almost damaging, actually.
Yeah, it's very counterproductive. It feels like it's keeping you safe, but it's actually setting you up for a relationship that could have a lot of cracks in the foundation if you keep doing that. And that's what's so hard about the work I do is usually when couples come to me, the cracks in their foundation have been there for a really long time, sometimes like 20, 30 years. So yeah, if you wait long enough, it can get to the point where they start questioning, is it too late?
Yeah, absolutely. Using this example, I've interviewed members of Live Jasmine who have said, I mean, I can't say for sure if they had these attachment issues, right? But they've said that they haven't really had success in relationships with women. And in fact, they were so shy that even if they saw a woman they really liked, they could not even approach her. And I've had a few members tell me this, but I'm thinking of one case in particular where the member told me he started having so many positive experiences with models on Jasmine, right? And that's by design. You should be having a positive experience. And for him, it was like, wow, he was really interested in these women. They're beautiful to him. And he kept having these positive experiences that he said he found himself approaching women he was interested in. And he would go up to them. And he thinks maybe he had done it enough times on Live Jasmine that it was like practice of some sort. But what's also interesting is he said that his boss started noticing, like, hey, you seem more confident. You're doing a lot better at work. It wasn't just in a romantic or sexual context that he had his confidence boosted. And I really, especially with your perspective in regards to attachment, I would love to talk about what you think is happening there.
I think something is getting rewired, just like you said, and I'll expand on that. But the neural pathways in our brain are very rigid. And this is when we stick to our patterns, and we all do it. We have our way of handling things, and that is my comfort zone. And my neural pathways are rigid, and I'm gonna keep it like that. Your neural pathways can become more flexible when you're exposed to different experiences. And the really hard part is you have to set yourself up for that exposure. That's the really hard part, is that the exposure is not just going to come to you. Like this person you're talking about, if he was like really nervous to go up to women, I would assume there weren't a ton of women going to him and making it easy on him. He was probably feeling like kind of stuck, like, gosh, I wish I could go to these women and I wish they would come to me, but if they're not, then what am I going to do? So, what I'm really saying is, I guess honestly, it goes back to like human connection. Like, I don't think we're meant to be in this world alone. And it's okay if we need validation from other people. I think people are afraid to admit that. You always hear, you've got to love yourself first. And I get that to a degree, but at the same time, if you can have these experiences where other people are confirming, like, you are attractive, you are worthy, you are interesting, we need to lean all the way into that. Like, we need to let that pour into us, because that's going to be exactly what we need to, like, kind of put ourselves out there more and feel a little bit more confident. There's absolutely nothing wrong with like absorbing all the validation and support you can get, because you can't really do it by yourself, and like with couples, I think what gets really hard is like, if they're trying to break a pattern, like let's say they are conflict avoidant and they're trying to not be conflict avoidant. The only way they're going to get that exposure, the practice of their conversations going better, is to take the emotional risk and give their partner a chance to show them it can go better. And then, okay, I can practice being more compassionate, and it's just that first step. So anyways, I know it's a long answer, but it makes me excited that, the person you're talking about gets to have such a positive experience that clearly has such a great impact on his life overall.
I'm curious if you've dealt with any form of camming or sex work of any kind in your practice, either someone that's seeing you is a performer, or maybe in relationships you've heard of one partner using a service, or I'm just curious if it's come up at all in your practice.
Oh yeah, definitely. I have a lot of clients that are on OnlyFans. I have clients that do cam, or maybe if they do now, or whether they used to. And I've had clients who have been like in the amateur porn industry, like filming videos. So I've had all of that. And I would say it's interesting you asked that question, because I know like me as a sex therapist, maybe it's more likely I would have clients who have that exposure or that experience. But with sex work being online, like even now compared to, 20 years ago, it's easier to be in that industry. I would be willing to bet a lot of therapists have multiple clients who are sex workers and don't even know it. They might not be disclosing that, but it's so easy, right? To be on the sites.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious if you've heard any particular feedback from any of them, like, your clients that have been on OnlyFans or camming, um, any particular positive or negative feedback that seems to be recurrent.
Yeah. I a big positive feedback with like camming or OnlyFans, especially for women. I feel like I have more female clients that maybe are a part of that. A big pro for them is being in control of what they want to do. I feel like in like amateur porn, for example, I'm not saying it's like this for everyone, but if you show up to a film set and they want you to do something that you're not prepared for and you feel pressured to do it, I know that can get really the like lines of consent can get really blurry. But with OnlyFans and camming, they're in full control. They feel like they have the freedom and confidence to say, here's where my limits are, and no one's going to tell me otherwise, which is great for them. And then the con that comes to mind, and again, I don't know how often this happens, and maybe not for everyone, but especially when you are online, you might run into people who are like inappropriate and who are trying to cross your boundaries or, kind of pushing it. But a friend of mine, actually, her piece of advice is really just to have a backbone. Like, you have every right to, if someone is harassing you, let's say, you don't need to put up with it. You get rid of them. So that's the feedback I usually hear.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so funny because whenever I ask our models what is the hardest part of what they do, they say the hardest part of being a model is dealing with trolls, like people who are just there to try and get a rise out of you or hurt you or be mean or be negative. That's the hardest part. Um, I think in general, whenever you're doing anything online, that is more or less going to be present and part of the job. Even, me, my background is in journalism and reporting, and I've been the host of many large digital channels. And so when people can get in the comments section, they will say the craziest things. Sometimes I think just to be funny, even though it could be hurtful or attention, whatever the case is. I mean, but
Yeah, people are awfully bold online. Like, I know for me as a sex therapist, I've um the example I think of is I was quoted in this article that was about gay sex. And I don't know like what, I can't remember what like Facebook page it was on, but there were so many ugly comments about the article and about everything that was said. And from my perspective, it was like a very nice, insightful, informational like article, but people can get really, ugly. And even like, so I'm a therapist. Like, I'm not in the sex work industry, but I think people assume I am because I'll get, weird messages, weird emails in the middle of the night. I've had dick pics sent to my phone. I've had like weird requests that I've had to like, block a number, delete emails. And so, or it could even be, I've had men call me before and they're like, oh yeah, I want to come see you for therapy, but I'm a nudist, so it has to be naked. And like, I know they're lying. I know they're just like being pervs. So I've had all of that, even like just as a sex therapist. So I can't imagine being right like a model. I can't imagine because people will be awfully bold in being so inappropriate.
wow, that's, sometimes when I interview, you know, public speakers or researchers or experts, they do tell me even they are stigmatized. Sometimes I remember interviewing a woman who is also a professional in the field, and she was giving a speech at a conference about some of her research it was around sex. And she said, she remembers like the snickering and the rolling of the eyes and people not taking her seriously because the research was around sex. And so I find it really interesting that it's really interesting that just anyone who has anything to do with sexuality gets some stigma or some inappropriate gesture or behavior.
Because we don't like to talk about sex, there's also like so much immaturity around it. Just saying the word sex, if there's like a 30-year-old man snickering, I'm like, what the hell are we doing here? Like, we're adult. We should not be like, we're laughing at, as if we're like 8 years old or something. So there is just like this level of immaturity that is annoying. But I think we don't ever want to talk about it. I think, and as I say this, anyone who does listen to this and who is religious, I hope they don't take offense, but I think religion plays a huge part of it, especially in Texas or like in the South, kind of where I am. Religion plays a huge part. Like, it's very much, there's so much shame wrapped around it. You should only be doing it once you're married. You should only be doing it when you have with the point of having kids. So when someone is open about it, it almost feels unnatural and taboo, almost like the conversation itself is what's inappropriate. And people are like nervously responding to it. And I think that's where the snickers come from and the little laughs come from. It's unfortunate.
If you have an opinion on how we start moving away from that, what are your thoughts there?
I think it starts with age-appropriate sex education. And I think sex education, and I might sound really radical when I say this, but I think sex education should start at a very young age. And when I say age-appropriate, like, I've had a lot of pushback on this because a lot of people will say, like, kindergarten, that's way too soon. And I'm like, I'm not asking us to bring a dildo to the kindergarten class. I'm just saying, like, there can be talks around like starting basic, what is consent, and that goes beyond just sex. If you have urges, what do you do with them in a non-harmful way? And there's resources out there that will tell you what's the best way to have these conversations at every age. And so I almost think it has to come from that proactive approach, because I know in my personal experience, absolutely no sex education. So you're just kind of like, learning it, kind of stumbling your way as you go. And I just think it can lead to a lot of hurtful behaviors that some people might not even realize are hurtful. And that can really it can really mess a lot of people up. So I just think it starts early and with a very proactive approach on education is what I would say.
What would you say your main goal? I mean, I'm sure it's beyond just one thing, but if you were to summarize your main goal as a sex therapist with your clients, what is it? What is the job really of a sex therapist? Like the truth of it,
Yeah. I have an answer. Honestly, the truth, what we're trying to do is challenge societal norms, and we're also combating patriarchy. That, I know that sounds so like radical and extreme, but literally patriarchy has ruined us, and it has ruined sexuality, and especially talking about like relationships that are, a man and a woman. Patriarchy makes intimacy really hard.
So do you feel like when you have, a client sitting in front of you or a couple, your real job is kind of like, all right, let me find those belief systems that got in there and let me figure out how to, like, you feel like you're dealing more with belief systems that got in and have caused problems than anything else?
Absolutely, for sure, especially with sex. Clients that are like, this is the only, this is the only thing I'll do. Like, I have clients who are just very boxed in to their belief system. And sometimes I will just have to ask, where did you learn that from? I've like an example I always think of is it was an older couple I was working with, and one of the partners said, well, women stop having orgasms when they reach 40. And I'm like, where did you hear? I'm curious where you heard that from. because that's not true, you know? So it's like funny in a way, but sad in a way that there's so many myths out there that people believe.
What are your thoughts on the role technology, even AI, is playing in sexuality?
I think it has a lot of benefits. I really do. Because with, like, let's say apps and websites, I think people can make relationships there that they wouldn't otherwise. And I'm even thinking about, you know, people who are kinky or people who are polyamorous or have open relationships. I don't think society is really ready to be totally open about that. And so the apps kind of have this, like, I say anonymity, like not like you're hiding who you are, but anonymous in the way of like I can meet people on there and my parents don't have to know about that kind of thing. So I think there's a ton of benefit because it makes it easier. And why not have it be easier? With AI, I don't know how I feel about AI yet. I haven't really thought about it in terms of like sex and sexuality. So that's an interesting question. I kind of have to think on.
Just to quickly go back to the apps and what you described as there seems to be some degree of like safety that people feel there. That is also something that plays a role in camming, where I think members sometimes feel more comfortable to express a true desire or sexual fantasy they have because there's this distance to a degree. It's online, they can just exit it out. This person doesn't know anyone they know. There's this degree of safety that it's really interesting when I think about it because it's like the separation allows them to come closer. You know
Yeah.
what I mean?
Which is it's funny you say that because that is what I'm always trying to teach my couples. When couples are, I'll go back to like being conflict avoidant. There's like some codependency in there, right? Of like, I don't want to say the wrong things. I'm not going to say anything because I don't want to upset them. And if they're upset, then I'm not okay, you know. And so I'm doing a lot of work to separate them in terms of like, if you're honest and it causes this temporary separation for you both to think as independent people, it's within that space that you can come back together and just accept where you are and you can actually be closer. So it's funny you say that because that separation is like needed
Yeah.
in a way for there to be true connection.
That's really interesting. I
It
feel like you have one of the most interesting jobs where you get to essentially see patterns in relationships and either with self or others in your clients.
yeah.
What would you say is one of the most interesting things you've learned in your career?
What comes to mind, there's been so many things. The simple answer is like people are complex, you know, but I would say the most surprising thing I've learned. I think before my career, when talking about infidelity and people who cheat, they're just kind of painted to be these like awful piece of shit, you know, you just need to leave them and be done with it. I've had many infidelity cases where the person who cheated is actually a really good person. And what they did wasn't great. Of course, their partner is hurt and they have every right to be hurt. But I think they're very like in society, very villainized. So it's kind of nice that I get that intimate time with them because a lot of them like feel a lot of remorse for it and are trying to figure out why would I have done that, right? Like why would that have been my first choice to go and do? And so there's a lot to unpack there with them. Whether or not their relationship works out, it's kind of nice for me to see them be vulnerable, even when like normally they would be villainized.
Yeah, absolutely. I heard this quote the other day and it stuck with me and I love it. It's before you extend judgment, extend curiosity.
Yes. Yes. Yep. That's like so true. And same with couples, you know, if partners can be curious about each other, so much connection in there. And often we rush to judgment. Even with our spouse, we rush to judgment.
What would you say are a few popular or mainstream ideas around human sexuality that are really misunderstood or misrepresented?
The one that comes to my mind first, and this is about like gay men and the type of sex that they have. There is this, I'm trying to think of how I want to say this. I feel like a lot of men don't ever want to do butt play because if they like it, it means that they're gay. And what I want everyone to know is that what you do during sex doesn't define your sexual orientation. Like you could enjoy prostate play, but you could do it with your female partner. It doesn't mean that you're gay. But I think, that's just like one thing that comes to mind is like, no, I'm not going to do these sexual things because then it means this about me, when it really means nothing about you other than that thing just feels good for me. So I guess what I'm saying is I think people stay stuck in their box and they stay really scared because they're always afraid, like, well, what does this say about me if I admit that I'm bisexual or whatever? And what I want everyone to know is it doesn't say anything. It is what it is, That's a big one. Oh, another one is that women become loose the more sexual partners they have, like their vagina becomes loose. I hear that one a lot. Or it's like you're kind of viewed as like you're going to be loose and not enjoyable if you've had too many partners. Biologically, that's just not true. I think it's a way to slut shame women, honestly.
Is there anything about your work, human sexuality, camming, that we didn't talk about, but you want to share?
I think we hit a lot of the important parts. All I really want to say is that if you want to do that type of work, do it. There's no shame in it. Why would you not? If it's something you want to do it. And just, keep it to your support system that is going to support you. And I mentioned that part because I think we have like all different kinds of people in our life, our friends, our family, our partners, whatever. Not everyone is in a role of being like the supportive, open, and welcoming person that you need. You don't need to tell them. Stick to who loves you for who you are.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. With many things in life, actually. Yeah. I think we all sometimes just tell people too much stuff that they don't need to know.
Yes. And they're not the right people always. And you don't need to change their mind. Just, be careful about who you really want to confide in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really well said. Absolutely. Making sure that the people that you are confiding in are safe to do so.
Absolutely.
This has been a really great interview. I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah, me too.
My final question for you is, and I think we touched on a few things already, but from your experience and your perspective, how do we move forward in laying the foundation for a more sexually well society?
I think we have to get uncomfortable. That's the only way. People really don't want to do that. But if we're going to create change, we have to. And it's just being brave. Like something is uncomfortable, something is scary to talk about. Find it within yourself to talk about it anyways. And especially, I'm going back to the sex education piece and our children. It has to start with our kids. It has to, because with a lot of adults, it's harder to create change the older you get. Let's focus on our children who have still a ton of room to go. We can be proactive with them and we can teach them that these topics don't have to be uncomfortable. I always say that the silence is very loud. Like I know in my household, we never talked about it, but it wasn't like it just never came up. It was like, no, we're not going to discuss that The silence is very, very loud, and it tells kids this is a bad thing. And that's kind of where the shame starts, because they're gonna, have their urges and play with themselves at some point, and they're gonna feel guilty about it. Don't let that be the environment in your household. Don't let it be silent. Just talk about it, and it's gonna change the future a lot if we can do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Yes, of course. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Yeah, I really enjoyed this interview.
Me too. And yeah, let me know if you ever need anything else from me in the future. I'm excited about this.
Yeah, it should.